Hey guys, welcome to a storytime video. If you want to get more content like this, want to support the channel, a link to our Patreon is down below. That's the best way that you can support the channel and get bonus content in order to kind of delve deeper into the subject of domestic discipline and get more videos like this. So in this week's storytime, I wanted to talk not necessarily about a specific story, but I wanted to talk about kind of my experience with something that I was talking to a friend with last night, and that is the subject of crying during discipline. Because I think that there's this misconception out there that in order for discipline to be effective, in order for you to have successful outcomes in your relationship, that the taken in hand needs to be brought to tears during discipline. And I think that is a misconception. That is something that you don't have to experience in order to have really effective discipline, to have a really successful relationship. However, for myself, I really do think that it was important for me to be able to be vulnerable enough to cry, and why that has been a journey for me, why I think that there's value in that, and I just wanted to talk through my experience. But just know that if you have a hard time crying during discipline, if you have a hard time crying in general, that's not something that you have to have any type of insecurity around. That's not something you have to feel bad about, because this is it's a very touchy subject. It's a very tricky subject because everyone is so different about this. And there's a lot of reasons why crying can be more difficult or easier, depending on personality type, depending on life experience, depending on a lot of things. It is not as simple as a spanking hurts, so therefore you cry. I will say that the spanking hurting more does make it maybe a little bit easier to let your guard down and to get to that place. However, there are plenty of people that can endure the physical aspect of a spanking without showing tears. And so don't think that if your taken in hand is not crying, that just means that you need to spank them harder. That's not always the case. So I wanted this video to focus on my experience and my journey with crying during discipline. Crying is not something that I felt comfortable with in the beginning. It's not something that came easily in the beginning. Now, part of that was, like I said, the physical aspect of spanking was a lot lighter in the beginning of our relationship. And so I didn't have the physical aspect of the spanking kind of bringing me to that place. But more than that, crying is an emotional response for me. It is, maybe 25% physical, but it is the majority of why I cry is emotional. So I had to get to a place where I could let my guard down, where I could become vulnerable. And that felt like it should have been easy because I'm with my husband. And at the beginning of our domestic discipline journey, we had been married, 10, 11 years. And so it was interesting because I was still so emotionally guarded in ways that I didn't realize that I was. And so it was very, very hard for me to allow myself to be vulnerable enough to cry. As we went through our domestic discipline, as we started to really see not only the benefit of rules and boundaries and structures and accountability, but also saw the benefits of deepened communication, deeper connection, really becoming a cohesive unit as a couple. Once we started to develop those aspects that domestic discipline really did facilitate, that is when I started to feel like I could fully embrace like the vulnerability and the emotional process of punishment. So looking back, I do remember a point in time where I would almost never cry. And it wasn't because the spankings were insufficient at the time. They were sufficient. They were successful. They did yield successful outcomes. But I didn't feel emotionally connected to the discipline process. And I think that is really where I needed to develop. Of course I had remorse that I broke a rule. Of course I didn't want to have to go through the discipline. Of course, all of those things, but I didn't have this emotional connection to how my behavior was affecting our relationship, how my behavior was affecting our connection, and I hadn't gotten to the place yet where the mere thought of disappointing Coda was enough to put me into an emotional state. Now that is the case. And I think that developed over time as we developed our communication, as we developed our connection, as I started to see our relationship as being so intertwined, so interconnected, that when I do something even minor, it creates disconnection, and it severs that level of deep connection. And that is enough now that is what makes me initially very emotional, is I feel distance in my relationship, and to know that my behavior, my actions, my lack of responsibility is what created that disconnection. That is what first puts me into that headspace to not only accept discipline, not only accept correction, not only learn from this mistake and really want to go through the discipline in order to fix that connection, in order to get back into a right standing in my relationship, but it also creates that emotional vulnerability within me. And I didn't have that in the beginning. And so over time that developed, and I would love to sit here and say that was a very intentional process, but it's something that I feel like it just happened. I do think that if you want to become more emotionally vulnerable, if you want to try to begin to let yourself cry more easily, that is something that you can be intentional about and you can develop more intentionally, but it is something that just kind of happened within me. I never used to describe myself as an emotional person, but I would now. I do have a tendency to lean into more emotional responses, and I think that's because I feel so much more secure in my relationship and in who I am, and that is a direct response from being in domestic discipline and having the connection that we have. Now, I will say that I still don't get to a real letdown cry during a spanking. Yes, I cry. Almost every single spanking, I cry, but not necessarily during the spanking itself. And I think that's where it gets a little tricky because, Coda is my head of household. He has to make sure that the discipline is getting me to that point, but he doesn't always see the results of that until after. I was talking to a friend and I was trying to come up with some sort of metaphor or visual representation of what that emotional process feels like to me. And what I came up with, and she loved it, she thought it was a great analogy, is if you've ever seen the end of any type of race, typically a marathon, where a runner has gone through this whole race and they are exhausted, they are pushing to the final finish line, they have gone through something very, very physically taxing, but they just push through until they cross that finish line and then they just collapse. That is what it feels like for me emotionally, is that I am going through this very physically taxing process. I am going through the physical aspect of the spanking, and sometimes my body just instinctually will kind of like hold it together, like my emotions will hold it together until I hear Coda put down that implement and I know that he is done. And then emotionally and sometimes physically, I just collapse. I let go. That is when I really start to just cry, to the point where there have been times where, I know that when he puts down that implement, when he is done, that I am allowed to get out of position at that point. And there have been times where I physically cannot get out of position, not because of any other reason than the emotional process that I'm going through at that time. I just stay in position and I just cry for a good few minutes. And I'll have to ask Coda what goes through his mind at that point, like what he's thinking, what his process is, because he does like come over and just put his hand on my back and give me some reassurance to let me know that whenever I'm ready. Like, there's a lot of unspoken communication that happens between us, and I actually really love that. But so that's just his way of saying, like, I am here. Take your time, but I'm here whenever you're ready. Afterwards, it feels like the weight of my misbehavior has been lifted. I've gone through it. I've been punished. I'm forgiven. And now the weight of the disconnection that I caused, it's almost like I'm grieving the fact that I put myself in this position. I'm grieving the fact that I caused that disconnection in my relationship. And it's almost like this relief that my mistakes didn't have bigger ramifications. It's this emotional relief and release that my relationship is back in good standing. The emotional process of being forgiven and forgiving myself, and it feels really overwhelming because all of those things happen at one time, and that's what causes me to really let down and really cry. I think that one of the reasons I can cry more easily now is because Coda is receptive to that. He is very supportive of that. He doesn't let me cry by myself. He will do whatever he needs to do in order to help me feel supported through that emotional process, because this part is what creates that deeper connection for us, is to know that I can be vulnerable in front of him and he will hold that space. He will support me and he will receive it. I know that there was a point where me crying was hard on him because I think that he didn't understand the emotional process aspect of why I cried, and he thought that I was crying as a response to the physical aspect of punishment, and so he felt like the fact that I was crying was indicative of him going too hard in punishment, which sounds silly now because that's not at all what was happening. And in fact, my punishments back then were so much lighter than they are now. But I think that that's what he was taking it as, and so he had a hard time because he felt like that was a sign that he was crossing a line in some way. And once we had some conversations about why I cry and why I need to cry, he started to see the positive aspects of me crying, because when I can release all of those emotions, when I can really process all those emotions, my stress melts away, my willingness to be in my role, my ability to submit, my ability to come under his authority, my how well I can follow the rules and structures of our home, that all becomes so much better, and I have such a deeper connection to all of those things when I can really have that release and really let myself cry. I think that the reason why crying can be difficult for some people is that we have been socially conditioned that crying is somehow a sign of weakness. And I definitely had that social conditioning as well. I definitely felt that way for a long time. I think that's why I tried to train myself not to cry. And I realized how detrimental that was to my personal growth. I realized how detrimental that was to the goals that I have as a take it in hand, as a wife, as, you know, just a person in general. I don't want to be callous. I don't want to be hardened. And sometimes you have to be, like, not everyone deserves your vulnerability, but when we are in these domestic discipline relationships, especially when that's within our marriages, our spouse deserves our vulnerability. Our head of household deserves our vulnerability. And so we need to learn to be able to give that side of ourselves over to our head of household, and in a way that feels right and feels good for your relationship. And that's not going to always result in tears, but you should have the emotional vulnerability even if you don't have that physiological response of crying. So don't take this as me saying, like, you have to cry, especially when I started this by saying that that's not the case, right? I just wanted to share my experience with crying, why I cry, why I see value in it, and why that's something that I really wanted for myself. I think that this is very, very personal. If you just are not the type of person to cry, that's okay. But I do challenge you to make sure that you are still offering that emotional vulnerability to your head of household, even if that doesn't result in the physical response of tears. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and we will talk to you next week.